Hey everybody, welcome to Cowboy Criminology. I'm Derek Judd, your host. Of course, I am the Cowboy Criminologist. So, I'd like to start off with some good news, bad news. The bad news is I'm not going to be able to do Serial Killer Saturdays for the next 2 Saturdays. Uh, I'm going to be out of town and just prepping for these appointments and kind of getting the house ready. I fell short of time. The good news is when I come back, uh, I'm gonna throw in some different changes to the way I do Serial Killer Saturdays, including breaking down the type of offender not only by their motive or their modus operandi, such as which would classify them as organized, disorganized, or mixed, but I'm also going to throw in the methodology used by Holmes and DeBurger. So it's going to should make it pretty interesting. Also, what I'm currently working on is I'm going to do a video about the 2 most realistic serial killers from Hollywood, and I'm going to talk about them. Of course, they're made up of actual serial killers based on real cases, but their portrayal of these offenders was so creepy that I think they deserve a mention, because if you recognize these signs in an individual in real life, you're going to realize you've got a problem on your hands. And for a special Serial Killer Saturday coming up in 3 weeks, I am going to be doing the very first case I ever profiled. And so I'm excited to kind of share with you about that. And what I want y'all to know about that case is I wasn't a police officer at the time. I wasn't a correctional officer at the time. I had 0 law enforcement experience at the time. But I was picking out details of the case based on what I was hearing from the expert analysts that were brought in by all the different news media organizations, and why there were many things I thought that these analysts were getting wrong. But I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to bury the lead. More importantly, I don't want you looking up the case to get a jump start on the homework, as it were. So I always want to communicate with y'all. I'm sitting at 86 subscribers as of this morning, which is very cool. Seem to be adding about 15 to 20 new subscribers every month, and I know that's some YouTubers wouldn't celebrate that, but I think it's a huge accomplishment. And going back and reading the comments that y'all leave on the channel convinces me that I have probably one of the more intelligent YouTube audiences out there, which is very cool to me. One of the things I like is sometimes y'all will put something in the comments that spurs something in my mind and helps me kind of rethink a different philosophy or different theory that I've had. And Miss Mac specifically said something in one of her last posts on the channel about nature versus nurture. And I had quit talking about nature versus nurture for a while, because when I was in grad school, I was taking a criminology class and nature versus nurture came up, and the instructor didn't really have a good real world example that she could use for nature versus nurture. And so she said, you might get in touch with Derek. He seems to be very, very knowledgeable about this kind of stuff. You might want to ask him. So this student reached out to me, and as I started explaining nature versus nurture the way I understood it, he bombarded me with all these questions that I had absolutely no answer to. And so it wasn't until several months later that I kind of realized that nature versus nurture is overly simplified, but at the same time, it gets to the root of the problem. So what are we missing? Okay. So let's do a little rewind. So if you don't know, the nature versus nurture argument has been used since the dawn of criminology to determine whether somebody is born a bad seed. This is the bad seed theory. This is no matter what intervention was done at any level, this individual was born bad and they're going to die bad. And that was deemed to be part of their nature. That was just their natural makeup. That is who they are at their core. Well, of course, that didn't fly for a lot of people. Because you have those detractors who say, well, no. You have people who, believe that all individuals are born good. All right. They come into this world not knowing anything about good, not knowing anything about bad. They know the things that make them smile, keep them full, keep them from crying, make them happy or content. So they tend to look at those things as being good. So this is where the nurture side of that came in. And the nurture side basically says that if individuals grow up in an environment that is detrimental to their development, especially during the years leading up to their psychosexual development, they are going to develop a deviant type personality, and they are going to seek out criminality. And Miss Mac is absolutely right. Nurture has a lot to do with that. And so I'm going to get all Bob Ross on y'all here for just a second, because I discovered the first happy accident on Cowboy Criminology. So if we go back, we've done 3 serial killer Saturdays. Okay, we had Richard Cottingham, we had Gerard John Schaefer, and then we had Gary Heidnik. So interestingly enough, whether consciously, subconsciously, however you want to look at it, each of these serial killers helps it illustrate a different point. Now, if you look at Gary Heidnik, it is so easy to sit there and think of his background. His mother's an alcoholic. His dad was incredibly abusive. And he never really had the structure that he was going to need to become anything other than who we know him as today. And I would have a very hard time fighting you in saying that nurture was 100% responsible for Gary Heidnik. Okay. So then we go back to Richard Cottingham. And Richard Cottingham, by all accounts, had no real reason to commit the crimes that he committed. Even though he was fairly lonely, didn't have a whole lot of friends, and tended to keep to himself, there wasn't anything really dark in him. But the other thing about that is so much of what we know about Richard Cottingham came from Richard Cottingham. So if you listen to anything that fool says, take it with a tiny grain of salt and a big glass of water, because I would be 99% likely to tell you that he's lying. Okay? But he could be an example of nature. Maybe it was just in him to become evil. Maybe he kept people at bay because he knew, he began to realize as he got older what he was, who he was. Okay? Then you have Gerard John Schaefer. Now, this is where nature versus nurture, they collide and they kind of butt heads. Because on one side, you have his dad, who was not the greatest role model. But on the other hand, he had a mother who was kind and caring and church going and really everything you'd think that a mother should be. Um, excuse me. Everything that a mother should be. Uh, so if you have that nurturing influence, that should be able to overcome nature. Okay. And so now where are we at? Because when you have somebody like Gerard John Schaefer, what do we do with that? It's difficult to understand because we have two opposing dynamics. It's kind of like the organized, disorganized, wait a minute, mixed. Now he's a little bit of everything. So I want you all to consider one more thing to add on to nature versus nurture. I want you to consider environment. And when you think of environment, environment is the space that an individual lives. Okay. And that's not, don't think of it as the physical space, but think of it as a psychological headspace. Okay. So Gerard John Schaefer spent a lot of time alone. He spent a lot of time out in the swamp, out in the bush in Florida, and he spent a lot of time hunting, fishing, being by himself. He had a lot of time to cultivate fantasy. And in cultivating that fantasy, he grew into an environment inside his head where he was comfortable taking lives. Okay? Now, environment is different for everybody. But let me contextualize it by saying this, okay? Richard Cunningham had a similar environment. He got interested in bondage pornography, and I talked in that video that I didn't think it was bondage pornography the way we think of it today. I thought of it as probably a true detective magazine, as being the more likely visual image that aroused his curiosity. Like Schaefer, he would have created an environment inside his head where he could get away from everything. He could get away from his loneliness. He could enact his fantasies. He could be whoever he wanted to be. He could be that idealized image of himself, and we all have it. We all do. Uh, every police officer I've ever talked to would relish the chance to deliver a baby on the side of the road because that is like the coolest cop story you can ever have. Because with all the bad things that police officers see, bringing new life into this world with two grateful parents who are going to love and take care of this child, man, that's just got to be the ultimate. Um, and it would be very difficult to get above that. Firefighters, you know, they want to be that firefighter who runs in and saves that individual from a high rise. Uh, we all have in our professions, in our personal lives, we all have this idealized self of who we could be at our absolute best. Unfortunately, sometimes you get these individuals who have these personality disorders and they go the opposite direction. They think about themselves, about how they could be at their worst, or at least at the worst of what I don't. Can we even use the term normal anymore? Because I don't. Starting to wonder if they even exist. But for all intents and purposes, I say it exists on this channel. So, uh, normal being somebody not drawn to criminal activity, not drawn to deviancy, and not wanting to torture innocent living creatures. All right. I do not consider hunters in that. Growing up, I know a lot of hunters, and a lot of them are, they use it to stock their freezers as a means to feed their family, and I can't certainly can't blame them for that. But getting back to environment, okay, so How does environment help us? Well, nature versus nurture, if you think about it, it's not really helpful until the individual is caught and you're sitting down and you're able to do that FBI style debriefing where you've got the questionnaire uh, that's 500-600 questions long, and you're able to sit down and you're able to go through every single question and be able to kind of see how this behavior started. But if you throw in environment is interesting because environment can tell you a lot about the criminal that you're looking for. And so I'm going to break this down and make it a little easier to explain. So Robert Ressler, John Douglas, Roy Hazelwood, in all of their consulting calls, they almost exclusively would interrupt whoever was calling for their help to say, stop. Tell me about your victim, and I will tell you about your unsub. Victimology is the key to criminal profiling. It really is. But victimology also tells you a great deal about the victim or about the unsub. So Richard Cottingham, where were his crimes committed? Hotel rooms. He disposed of his victims in the river. He was very much, because of what he did to his bodies, he was somebody who was very much in his head. Was he insane? Absolutely not. But this is somebody who devoted a lot of time to the fantasy of what he was going to do to his victims. Okay. The environment for Richard Cottingham, somebody very in their head. Okay. Now, usually this is somebody who feels like they're not seen. Now, remember, he worked for a huge corporation where he was just a number. He was an employee number on a timestamp. He had a decent home life, but even as his wife said, as his criminal career started escalating, so too did his alienation of affection with her, and that caused some issues. So because his wife began to rebuke him, he began to seek out women who wouldn't. Who would that be? Prostitutes. Who were his victims? Prostitutes. Where did he take them? He'd take them to hotels. Nice hotels? Absolutely not. Took him to no-tell motels, places where he could be anonymous, places that rent by the hour, lax on identification, and things like that, places he could play in cash, where he didn't leave a paper trail. But part of his environment was Cottingham knew that he was a faceless cog. And I think in a lot of ways that's how he felt in his personal life, but he wasn't going to be a faceless cog in his environment. But you look at the hotels he took, you look at who his victims were, and you look at him, especially in his early arrest photos, and he was there was nothing memorable about him. Matter of fact, Peter Vronsky, in his book, when he's relating that anecdote about running into Richard Cottingham, or actually Richard Cottingham running into him, he didn't think anything about him. He was just another guy, a seat filler at an award show. Nothing spectacular about him. Okay, but that also would tell you that when you let yourself into that individual's environment, you could sit here and say, okay, this guy is probably more than marginally employed, probably has a very decent job, has a home, but he's not willing to bring any of this stuff around his family. So he compartmentalizes it. He has a work life, he has a home life, and then he has the environment. Okay? And so when you add environment in there, especially with Richard Cottingham, where nature versus nurture doesn't make a whole lot of sense because there's nothing that really pushes that one way or the other. Gerard John Schaefer, his environment, we talked about him quite a bit. In fact, we had to stretch him into 2 weeks of Serial Killer Saturdays just because there was so much there to unpack. But with him, his environment is similar. He spent a lot of time in his head, a lot of time trying to prove his dad wrong about who he was. Ms. Mack, you also mentioned a mother's role or parental roles in the development of a child and how that directly affects how the child will grow up. And I could not agree more. And it's interesting that some serial killers, the vast majority of serial killers, seem to have either a love-hate relationship with their mother, but the relationship with the father is usually absentee, absentee, weak, or abusive. There's never really anything about the father-son relationship that's anything other than less than functional. Now, exception to that would actually be Jeffrey Dahmer, because his dad, realizing that Jeff was a lonely kid, tried to take interest in Jeff's desire to learn about dead animals and do dissections and taxidermy and things like that. And with Lionel Dahmer being a scientist, he may have just thought that Jeff was exceptional and was just displaying a particular scientific intellectual curiosity. But Jeffrey Dahmer is one of those guys where you'd have to look at environment, because like Richard Cottingham, or I'm sorry, like Gary Heidnik, Jeffrey Dahmer committed most of his crimes, his atrocities, in his own home, which tells you a lot about that type of individual. But we'll get to a little bit more about him later. But with Gerard John Schaefer, he despised his dad, despised what he was doing to his mother, and basically blamed his dad on the whole breakdown of the family. And so in Schaefer's mind, he created this environment where he became this mission-oriented serial killer, where he was going to rid the world, or at least his own little corner of it, of these harlots, these promiscuous young women who destroy families. And that's probably an oversimplification, but because Schaefer was such a lonely child, we can infer that he probably, based on where we find his victims, we can assume that he never brought a whole lot of friends around his house, which means that whatever happened at the house stayed private to him. That was something completely separate. So he would create an environment where he had complete and total control over his victims. And that environment was somewhere he felt comfortable, not only physically, but also in his head, because he spent so much time there. And obviously we talked about how the fantasies crept up. And of course we talked about his writings. And if you've had a chance to look at Killer Fiction, I'm sorry. And if you have read it and you gleaned some insight in there, good for you. Like I said, I would never recommend anybody read that. It's absolute trash. But if you're just bound and determined to understand the mind of a sexual sadist, I can't really think of a better place to start. So that tells you a lot. Finding victims out there like that, especially trussed up to the trees and everything, give a lot of indication about if it doesn't say anything about nature versus nurture, we can kind of work backwards from the environment where we find the victims, starting with victimology. Okay, these victims are tied to a tree. He buries them in a shallow grave. The dirt never gets fully compacted, so we know he comes back. This means for some reason his home life is untouchable. Okay, so that can lead us to say that this could probably be pushing towards a bad relationship. Now, it's easy to jump to the idea that, well, he probably hates his mother. We've talked about that in several videos, and I told you that that's usually useless. But we can trace it back to some sort of conflict within the home. So while Richard Cottingham's pointed to nature, a lot of ways Richard Cottingham's is pointing towards nurture, but we don't really know. And the other thing is when a lot of these serial killers have siblings who grow up and become productive members of society, they marry, they have children, they stay in functioning relationships, they have long-term gainful employment. We have to wonder just exactly what effect nature, nurture, environment, and what that collision was to create the individual that we know. So Gary Heidnik is a prime example of that. Now, you and I are detectives. We're in Philadelphia, and we get a call because we're the ones who handle the most bizarre cases on the planet, and we get a report that a missing woman has been found. Go good guys. We found a missing person. No. She's got a story that you guys need to hear. Okay. So we go, we talk to her, and she says that she's been locked up in this house. She was working as a prostitute, and she gets taken to this house. She goes through and she's explaining all of these things to us. Now, she talks about other victims being taken, how 2 of them are dead. She describes torture, sexual assault, starvation, all of these horrific things. She describes a pit in the bottom of the basement. All of these things start going through our minds like, holy crap, we got to get over there. But we're not average detectives, so we're going to sit there and we're going to think about this. Let's say we got there and we had no other information, or before we got there, this individual had cleaned out the entire house, taken the victims to an undisclosed location, and she didn't know a name. She didn't know anything about this individual. Based on the fact that she talked about how he bricked up the windows, attempted soundproofing, one thing or another, to fortify the basement. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us most people would say, well, a barricade. If somebody barricades themselves inside a home, they're trying to keep someone out, or more disturbingly, they're trying to keep somebody in. And if you think of the environment that creates, what does that create? What does that tell us? Well, that would tell us that you have somebody who spends a great deal of time inside their mind, almost like they feel trapped inside their mind. Who feels trapped inside their mind? A lot of times that's how people with schizotype disorders talk about their feelings. Like they feel like a healthy, normal person, but they're trapped inside a mind that's not normal, that's not healthy. If you think of the house as a metaphor for this person's mind, and they're showing you that, because all criminal acts are behavior, but not all behavior is criminal. Okay, that would show you, looking around Gary Heidnik's house, you'd be able to get a feeling for this individual's mind, and you'd start to see that there is a high likelihood that this person is very mentally ill. So, what could you do recognizing this environment? It might lead you to contact the local mental health hospitals and mental health facilities and start getting a rundown of recent released people. You coordinate that with prior arrest records for sexual offenses, assault, and specifically burglary and arson. We'll get to that in another video. But all of those things would lead you, at least in theory, to talk to Gary Heidnik. And unfortunately, who knows what other types of criminal activity you're going to uncover. But if you add environment in and you work backwards from the victimology, you can start to see that with Gary Heidnik, everything happened in the home, because for him, everything always happened in the home, but he never wanted to discuss what happened in the home outside of that. So that's kind of a broad overview, and I mean, you could really deep dive that, but that's just kind of a taking the nature versus nurture argument, but adding another component, a psychological component, and a psychological component that can manifest itself in a physical location, using victimology to help you work back, to help you discover some insights about who you're looking for. So that's just kind of a cool exercise. Y'all, I'm so sorry I'm going to be out of pocket for the next couple weeks, but I've got some really good stuff coming up, and I also hopefully we'll be able to make a special announcement about another project. In the meantime, if you get lonely for Cowboy Criminology, if you'll check out my website, cowboycriminology.com, I have a crime blotter bulletin on there where I talk about, one of my last ones was about how to use behavioral clues to write a search warrant in a kidnapping. So very, very cool to look at that. And I'm going to be updating that because it's going to be easier for me to do that than to try to film videos on location. So, y'all, thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, and share on your favorite social media platforms. And we'll see you here in a couple of weeks. Take care.